Good morning, everybody. My name is Kyle Wilhoit. I am a threat researcher at Trend Micro. And today I'm going to cover who's really attacking your ICS devices. This talk isn't going to cover vulnerabilities, really, or any new exploits or ODAs or anything like that with ICS systems. What this talk is going to cover is first kind of an overview of ICS itself, and then I'm going to get into a story about a couple different attacks that occurred in ICS environments. For those of you that aren't familiar with ICS or SCADA, this talk can still be directly applicable to you guys, so don't worry if you don't really have any familiarity with SCADA, ICS, anything like that. This should still be directly applicable and still be interesting for those of you that aren't familiar. Before we get started, I'm going to go ahead and go into a little bit about who I am. Again, I'm a threat researcher at Trend Micro. Primarily, I research and blog on the criminal underground, persistent threats, malware-based espionage, those types of things. Bachelor's and master's in computer science, currently pursuing my PhD. And my research areas traditionally focus in malware detection and reverse engineering, persistent threats, and again, malware-based espionage, ICS and SCADA security, and how kind of those two areas play into that, as well as vulnerabilities in the underground. Again, it kind of all four of those areas play together, and a lot of this is going to be focused on that. What the presentation is going to focus on, first of all, it's going to focus on concerns and overview of ICS security. It's also going to cover ICS in general. So for those of you that aren't necessarily involved with ICS or SCADA every day, it's still going to give you a good primer, at least to understand some of the concepts I'm discussing during the talk. Also, it's going to discuss how terrible the security profiles of ICS devices and architectures are. It's going to discuss that in fairly good depth. So again, for those of you that aren't necessarily familiar, it's going to be getting a little bit in depth on how those profiles of ICS devices are and how bad they're traditionally deployed. It's going to cover how are ICS devices attacked. We get in pretty in depth here during the story time that I go into, and that's where we start to go in depth on more of that. And then also who attacks ICS devices. That's going to be covered a little bit later on as well. Quick agenda. ICS overview, so just a quick look into what ICS is. Typical ICS deployment, so that's going to include architecture, how they're traditionally deployed, and we'll note a couple things during that time. The overview of two SCADA protocols, the two most common SCADA protocols we're going to cover today. There are multiple, but we're going to just cover two. ICS vulnerabilities. That's traditionally ICS devices and SCADA devices that are vulnerable. SCADA on the internet. I know a lot of you have heard about Shodan, eRIP, all the services that allow you to profile devices on the internet. SCADA devices are no different, and in fact, there are a lot of devices that are internet-facing in the SCADA environment, so we're going to cover some of that as well. And then we get into the story. I'm not much of a storyteller, so I apologize, but it should be interesting nonetheless. Then we get into the findings from the actual story, the attacker profile from the story, and then recommendations on how to prevent some of these attacks from occurring. So for those of you that are in ICS SCADA, that can help out some on how to mitigate some of these attacks that are found. So first things first, what is ICS? ICS is essentially used in everything and virtually everywhere during the manufacturing process. So it's used in water, gas, energy, automobile manufacturing, you name it. If there's any type of manufacturing process built, ICS devices are very typically going to be used in that environment. They're notoriously insecure in every way. I say this very loosely, meaning that whenever I say they're notoriously insecure, I'm saying that there are published vulnerabilities that exist with Siemens controllers, for instance. There are exploits that exist in the ICS SCADA environment. Those do exist. Also, tied around that same thing with notoriously insecure is the architecture of ICS. Traditionally speaking, ICS is deployed in a very antiquated way, meaning that these devices are deployed 20, 30 years ago before security was really a thought in this environment, in the manufacturing environment. So the notoriously insecure not only plays in with vulnerabilities, exploits, but also in the actual architecture and deployment of these devices. So it's kind of a twofold insecure scenario. Software is sometimes embedded, sometimes not. A lot of that depends upon the actual device manufacturer and the purpose of the device. So for instance, if the ICS controller is made to control a belt, for instance, in an automobile manufacturing system, that will more than likely have embedded software because it has a very dedicated purpose and function, meaning it has one thing to do and that's it. It doesn't have to worry about connecting out to the internet, for instance. It doesn't have to worry about sending traffic elsewhere. And also, the ICS devices are traditionally and typically proprietary, meaning that these devices have a dedicated purpose and they're proprietary to the manufacturer of those products. So a Siemens controller, for instance, is actually going to be running, traditionally speaking, Siemens-based software. What does a typical ICS network look like? Like this. For those of you that aren't familiar, SCADA, the common term SCADA, is what sits on top. That's the supervisory network. The control system networks sit below that. There's a couple things to note. The supervisory network, or SCADA network, communicates directly into the control system network. The control system network, in this case, is what's controlling the belt speeds. That's what's controlling anything that's going to be involved on that ICS or SCADA system. The supervisory network is what issues those commands. So that's typically the hands behind the keyboard. That's going to be the individual going out, typing on a keyboard to say, I want to speed up this belt to whatever RPM. Couple things to note here. First of all, you're going to notice there's no security. That's not because I forgot to put it in the diagram. It's because this is a traditional deployment. I worked at a very large industry or very large energy company in a past life, and this is almost directly mimicked from that energy company. There's no firewalls. There's no IDS, IPS. There's really no security to speak in this environment. And again, it's not because I forgot. It's because that is a traditional deployment. It really doesn't exist. So to really understand how a typical ICS device or ICS network works, you have to dive into a couple different protocols. The first is DNP3. It's used to send and receive messages, and it's traditionally very complex. There's a couple iterations of DNP3. There's a secure DNP3 protocol that was developed somewhat recently, but the problem with that is, again, it's hard to go back and actually redeploy ICS devices that are antiquated. It's difficult to do that. So in this case, it's very complex. There's no authentication, no encryption, really no surprise there. And there's several published vulnerabilities. One of those vulnerabilities is actually inherent to the protocol itself. There's an inherent trust that exists that DNP3 traffic is going to actually be sourced in the same subnet, meaning fundamentally it's said that in DNP3, if a device is actually communicating with another device, it's always going to be in the same subnet. As we know, that's 99.9% of the time not the case. So that's one of the largest vulnerabilities that exists with DNP3. Next protocol is Modbus. This is the oldest ICS protocol. It's the first real ICS protocol that you can think of. It controls input and output for different controls itself. That's mostly what it does. It does do other functionality, but most of the time it's just to control input-output. There's no authentication or encryption, no surprise there. There's no broadcast suppression, which is an interesting scenario. So if you're interested in going out onto an ICS or SCADA network and do some sniffing, you're not going to have much of a problem there. And there are vulnerabilities published with Modbus as well. A couple things that I wanted to cover as well are the security concerns with ICS versus traditional IT systems. ICS, for the most part, and again, I'm using this as kind of a broad direction, so keep in mind that some IT shops or some security individuals in the IT organization in security, they might have different priorities. They are worried about protecting the data, protecting communication channels, and limiting interruptions. Those are really the three that I view as being very important. Again, it might differ in your particular organization or your particular function, but as a broad generality, that's pretty important. From an ICS standpoint, you're going to notice something. There's no security. Productivity is the number one. Uptime is the second. Reliability of data is the third. You're going to notice that those three all revolve around ensuring that the system and the actual data gets to where it's destined, and to make sure that functionality doesn't get interrupted. There's really no security built in. So that's kind of, I wanted to be able to compare what the difference between a traditional security IT shop would be thinking about security, and ICS, kind of what you would think about as a traditional engineer. As I discussed earlier, there are some ICS vulnerabilities. This isn't a new topic. In 2012 alone, there was 171 unique vulnerabilities affecting ICS products. There's 55 vendors in total that were affected. It's an interesting statistic, and And on top of that, 26% of those devices or those vulnerabilities revolved around internet-facing infrastructure and devices. And included in that 26% was water. You'll understand the significance behind why I mentioned water in just a couple minutes. And again, most of you have heard about Shodan, you've heard about using Google Foo to go out and actually look for devices that are vulnerable. And SCADA is no different. ICS devices are no different. Unfortunately, again, whenever ICS architectures were deployed and created, it was created and deployed in a very antiquated fashion. They didn't really think about the internet, they didn't really think about devices facing the internet, and they didn't really think about locking down protocols that were internet facing. They were looking for the ease of going out and performing their job function, meaning if they go out and say an engineer goes home, he doesn't like getting called at 2 in the morning because a belt went down. I don't particularly care for it either. What they had the problem of doing is opening up those communication channels to the internet, so while they're sitting at home, they can just log into the belt, modify what they need to, correct what the issue is, and get it back up and running. They didn't really think about individuals going out and looking at these devices and attacking them. A couple examples here. The first one I just used Shodan and typed in VxWorks. You can see that it's a pretty staggering number. Now, keep in mind that not all of these devices are necessarily insecure, etc., but you can see the number alone. At the top country, for instance, is China with 19,000 plus devices, and the United States is second with 12,000 plus devices, etc. But again, keep in mind, that's not necessarily saying that those devices are vulnerable. It's just saying that they're internet-facing. It's an attack platform. It's a large foundation for attack, to go out and at least look. Second piece over there is an actual Google query that I performed. And you're going to see some interesting stuff. The first thing it says is meter information. And you can see some statistics underneath that. It shows 120.00, 120.00 system, et cetera, et cetera. That's actually a water pump in San Francisco, California that's wide open. You can click on that, go in, do whatever you want to it. It's no longer that way. I had gone out and disclosed that, but that is wide open at the time. Performing a simple query in Google, you'll easily find that stuff. Another example, a couple examples, Pastebin, eRip, and Twitter. Pulled a couple examples for each of those. The first one is from Anonymous, just listing out some different dorks and things to be able to find ICS SCADA systems. So easy to go out and try to find an attack profile, attack footprint with that. Pastebin, so you're going to see USA government-owned SCADA systems, power and meter transducer SCADA systems. And then they go through and they list IPs, they list host names of those devices. I'd gone out, looked at those devices, and again, not surprisingly, a large majority of them are unlocked, open, you can do pretty much whatever you want. A large number of those are also universities worldwide. Same thing there. Universities in the SCADA environment have a surprisingly insecure deployment. So you're going to notice, if you ever find that list, still a lot of those that are open. And then eRip is kind of similar to Shodan. Gives you a good ability, again, to cross-reference what you find in Shodan and do the same type of query in eRip, and then tie the two together and say, okay, realistically, what does the attack profile look like? What could I target? So now that we have a foundation of these actual devices and kind of the protocols, et cetera, the goal wasn't to go in really depth on some of this. The goal is now to discuss the actual story itself. The story is about a small town in rural America. I actually took that photo as I was driving on the highway. It's a water pump controlling water pressure and availability in this small town. It's about 18,000 people roughly, give or take. And that water tower itself is what actually controls the water pressure, the water availability for that town, that pump itself. The water pressure system's internet facing, no firewall security measures in place at all, and could cause catastrophic water pressure failures. Really no different than any other device that we've discussed, right? Internet facing device, no security implemented, really nothing there. The bad thing is, it was attacked several times during quarter 3, quarter 4 of 2012. Attackers successfully gained access. This hasn't been made public yet. And this isn't a story, it's a real life event. So this actually happened. It happened during Q3, Q4 2012. The only difference is it happened in my basement. I set up now what's considered a honeypot and a multitude of honeypots in my basement, as well as scattered throughout the USA, looking for who really does attack these devices. With that, Surprising amount of attacks came about, and we'll get into depth on some of those. But this is where it kind of starts to get interesting. The first thing that I'll do is kind of discuss the actual overview of the architecture, et cetera. I am going to leave out some detail. This research is still actively going on, so I am going to leave out some detail. If there is additional detail that you're looking for, feel free to talk to me afterwards or contact me with the information at the end of the slides, and I can give you more detail based on that. There's 2 low interaction honeypots and 1 high interaction honeypot. For those of you that aren't familiar, a low interaction honeypot is traditionally viewed as a software-based honeypot, something that would be a service emulation. So it goes out and emulates a service that's traditionally valid, meaning if I'm going to go out, I would emulate HTTP, for instance. That's a low interaction. A high interaction is going out and actually utilizing physical infrastructure and building out a honeypot that looks almost identical to a real production environment. It ran for 28 days in total, and again, it's still currently running, but the testing period for which I gathered the statistics that you're going to see coming up is for 28 days. It was the low interaction honeypot environment as well as the high interaction honeypot was deployed in a combination of a Windows Server 2008 box and 2 Ubuntu 12.04 servers. So really nothing too complex there. I mean, freely available pretty much anywhere you go. You're going to notice a couple things. These 2 screenshots are directly from the actual website that I created and front-ended for this honeypot architecture. You're going to notice a couple things, and I did this on purpose. First thing is, you're going to see on the bottom picture, it says this is a production unit, which it's obviously not. Making changes will violate the integrity of the water monitoring system and could adversely affect water containment. I wanted to make it very clear to whoever this was that if they modify this system or attempt to modify this system, it could accurately and cause catastrophic issues to the water containment. You'll also notice that on the top side it says submitting changes may adversely affect systems. So these are both very clearly outlined, and I'd actually gone back based on some of the attack statistics that I was seeing and added translations directly for this on the page directly under that. I added it for, I think, Chinese, Spanish, French, and a couple other languages. That way there was no excuse that some of these attackers couldn't read it in their native language. So I was trying to go that route. This is what the attackers see whenever they go out and actually look for the honeypot. The attacker, denoted by the little red guy over there, just going out through the internet, sees an external IP, and that's what's mimicking the control system, and then the PLC sits on the backside. So I'll go in depth a little bit here. The external IP, or the mimicking control system, is what you can consider the device that's controlling the back-end infrastructure, right? So that's where you issue commands that actually get executed on the PLC that would cause the issue with the device, with whatever device is. In this case, it's a water pressure meter. So if someone's going out and hitting this external IP, it actually, if they execute a command or attempt to execute a command, it's going to go back and modify the PLC, which would in turn modify the actual water containment system. A couple things to note here as well is that the external IP that's listed, I also had purchased a host name that was very similar to the city that I had gone out and mimicked. What I had done at that point as well is, and I'll get into a little bit more depth about this, but what I had done also is gone out and actually registered a valid email address, etc., to be able to have contact information that looks valid, and I included that on the actual sites themselves. We'll get into that again a little bit. This is kind of just a rough overview of the high interaction architecture. Again, there's some modifications to this, and I left out some pieces as well, just because this is ongoing research. And again, if you have questions about this, feel free to talk to me offline. The external facing URL sits on what I consider at that point a physical host. It's a Dell DL360, so a couple thousand US bucks, I think. Remote management was achieved outside of that. There's 2 administrative functions that pipe out to 2 different devices. The first was a Nano 10 PLC. This is a consumer grade or just kind of a testing device that individuals typically purchase to modify very small organizations or very small environments. In this case, I purchased it obviously to set up a honeypot. And then I also used a Siemens Simatic S7 1200. You can buy these on eBay, I think 600 US, so very cheap. And that's what I deemed the control system network. Then I have a physical host, which again is a DL360, and I put salted docks. Now whenever I say salted docks, I'm not referring to the traditional term salted. What I'm saying, and we'll get into depth a little here coming up on this, but whenever I say salted docks, I'm referring to documents that I controlled that I was looking for someone to attempt to go out and take. So what I was doing was making it very enticing for these individuals. If they compromised the system, I made it very enticing for them to not go out and access these documents and not exfiltrate them. That was the goal. Low interaction honeypot. You're going to see it's pretty similar to the high interaction, not a lot of difference. The only difference is that I utilize the cloud pretty extensively. I also utilize some physical infrastructure as well, but a lot of cloud infrastructure. And this is kind of where service emulation comes into place. So the first Amazon EC2 instance, and the reasoning behind using Amazon is it was cheap. Pretty much it. And it's very easy to spin up and spin down EC2 instances in a matter of seconds. Again, in this case, an external IP, it's mimicking the control system with the URL. Then I used the Honeywall, which is virtual networking. It allowed me to virtually network between several different virtual instances of operating systems. And then I had a fake ICS controller sitting on the backside, which is what I deemed the control system network. I did service emulation. I created a couple different ways to create what appeared to be valid network traffic for DNP3 and Modbus. So this traffic to an attacker, to someone that would even be familiar with an ICS or SCADA device communicating, would look at that traffic and find it to be very similar. In fact, they would have a very hard time not knowing that that was not necessarily valid commands. The purpose behind that and the thinking behind that is if an attacker would go out and actually start sniffing that traffic and be able to try to then man in the middle it or try to modify the traffic before it goes to the control system network, if they knew enough about DNP3 or Modbus, they would not be concerned that it could be that it wouldn't throw a red flag, essentially. Then again, I have the salted documents that kind of sit off on their own area, and again, that is for a separate function that we'll get into. Some of the tools that I use, and again, keep in mind that this isn't necessarily every tool that I use. This is just a collection of them. For other reasons, I can't necessarily disclose all of the resources that were used, but nonetheless, this is a good sampling of those. I used Amazon EC2. I used Dell servers, Siemens controllers. I used Snort, which was very heavily used. And then I used what's called a quick draw signature, which I took Snort signatures that were created in the past. A company had done some pretty rigorous development work on creating Snort signatures for ICS devices, traditionally for DNP3 and Modbus. In this case, for quick draw, I took those rule sets, I deployed those traditionally, and then I modified some of those as well and created my own rule sets. So in between Snort and quick draw, I was able to go out and actually see and really create custom rule sets. And then I also used Dynav for being able to collect malware samples. There was a lot of script kiddie action, and we'll get into that here shortly, but there was a lot of script kiddie action, but I wanted to see if there was any interesting malware that was dropped on the box or attempted to drop, something along those lines. So what vulnerabilities did I present? First was just SNMP vulnerabilities, traditional read-write, SNMP, packet sniffing, IP spoofing, all the traditional SNMP vulnerabilities that you would see if you were out doing a vulnerability scan. So this is nothing too new here. If you're going out performing a vulnerability scan, those of you that are familiar know what vulnerabilities I'm speaking about. They're very antiquated, SNMP, old. Authentication limitations, and what I mean by that is that I had secure areas of these particular websites. These secure areas, in some instances, I put admin, just as username and password, and I also did admin and then a more complex password. And then in other cases, I actually used the traditional default username and password configuration for control devices, seeing that if someone was looking for a device and they noticed that it was a Siemens S7 device, would they then go out and Google what's the default username and password for that device? If they would, then that obviously shows that they're getting more interested, and I wouldn't say targeted, but at least they're getting more interested in that particular device, and they're wanting to go out and compromise that in some fashion or another. I also presented limits of Modbus and DNP3 authentication and encryption. If you remember back to earlier slides, I didn't, DNP3 and Modbus don't have authentication. They don't have encryption. There are iterations, again, that support those technologies, but in this case, it's not supported. So it's vulnerable to spoofing, it's vulnerable to sniffing the actual traffic, etc. I also presented a VxWorks vulnerability, which is utilizing just FTP, wide open on that, and then I also configured default username, passwords, etc. And then open access for certain ICS modifications. So in this case, it would have been fan speed, temperature, utilization, and containment of the water system. So I know at this point, a lot of you are saying, okay, this is all fine and dandy and I like that, but what do you consider an attack, right? You have to define what an attack is in this case. I'm not counting an attack, something that would be a drive-by. I don't care about that. I don't care about script kiddies going out and then mapping the system. None of that stuff matters because I'm looking for who is really going out and looking at these devices to attack them. I don't care about somebody trying to go out and remotely, try to exploit a system that doesn't even exist. It doesn't matter. So I'm referring to only attacks that were targeted. So whenever I'm referring to the numbers coming up, I'm referring to attacks that were directly targeted at these systems. I'm also looking at attempted modification of pump systems, meaning that they went out, utilized FTP, Telnet, Modbus, DMP3, any of those protocols or services, and directly tried to interact with those devices and compromise them in some way or the other. And then again, as I said, only attempted modification via Modbus and DMP3. So point 2 and 3 are very closely tied together. And then DOS and DDoS attacks will be considered depending on the scenario. In this case, there wasn't any DOS or DDoS attempts, but I wanted to include that just in case that it was attempted for whatever reason. So this is the actual attack profile. These are the attacking countries that I had seen from an overall standpoint. One point is that I didn't just utilize IPs to gain this information. So don't just think that I went out and did a whois on an IP and said, oh yeah, it's a IP in the Netherlands that is trying to compromise the system. There was more detail involved in that. I can't necessarily discuss it now, but again, talk with me afterwards and I'll be happy to talk with you about how I ascertain more detail behind that. A couple things to note here. You're going to notice the countries on the left and the actual number of attempted attacks are on the right. A couple things to note here. Again, these are attacks that I considered targeted. These are attacks that would traditionally affect these systems in one way or the other. It may not be full compromise of the water system. It may not be that the system brings itself down completely. It's just a targeted attack of some sort. What I can say is out of this entire collection of attacks, there were 12 attacks that were directly applicable to causing damage to this water pressure system in one way or the other. It would have been affecting water pressure contamination. It could have been any number of things, but there were that number of attacks that directly affected these systems. So in this case, China is the first with 17, USA with 9, and then Laos with 6. A couple other interesting ones is North Korea. So after some of the, there's been some recent, for those of you that may be familiar, there's been some recent political things that have been kind of stirring up with North Korea. And I started to see an attack pretty quickly thereafter against this Honeypot system. And then also there was some other smattering of attacks throughout the world. An attack overview. So this kind of gives you a decent idea of what you're looking for. VxWorks exploitation attempt. There was 2 of those. So that would have been someone going out, probably attempting an Nmap scan, something like that, seeing that VxWorks was running, and then attempted to actually exploit that particular service. Then there was 12 attempts to shut down the pump system. I'm using that as a catch-all, or essentially just a category. Whenever I say there's an attempt to shut down the pump system, that can be from someone gaining access through the admin site and clicking shut down and submitting it. Or it could be someone going out and actively modifying DMP3 or Modbus to shut down the system. So I use that as a broad category to cover everything that was attempting to shut down that pump. Modifying temperature output. This was an interesting one. What I wanted to try, I thought if I was an attacker, what would I want to do that would really cause some mayhem? Yeah, shutting down the pump system's pretty cool, and yeah, people are without water. But how cool would it be to be able to then go out and instead of shutting down the system, but distribute and dispense boiling water to people if they turn on the cold water lever? I included that, and essentially there were 7 attacks against that. I mean, it's not really funny if it would have happened, of course, but nonetheless, something I wanted to consider. Modify the pump pressure, and this is the case if someone were to go out and try to turn on their water, their tap, and nothing came out, or too much water came out, or too quickly, something along those lines. There was 5 attacks on that. Secured area access attempt. There was 9. And by access attempt, I'm referring to they were able to gain access to secure area of the website based on default credentials of that control device, or B, actual access just via admin or something along those lines. So it was someone going out and actively attempting that. Modbus traffic modification. There was 2 of those, which That's surprising. I honestly didn't expect to see anybody really attempt to do any Modbus traffic modification. Primarily because to do any Modbus traffic modification in any fashion, you really have to understand the protocol. It's not something that you can really go out and just say, yeah, I know what Modbus is, I'm going to Google it. You really should, and you really have to understand the protocol to be able to modify it and attempt to modify it. So that was an interesting statistic that I didn't honestly expect to see. And then modification of CPU fan speed. That's the actual device which essentially could have caused catastrophic failure in the water pump system. So any type of modification to the CPU fan system on the device, that's where this kind of fits in. All right, so now kind of just a quick overview of Snort findings for those of you that are really familiar with Snort. Again, I use Digital Bond's quick draw SCADA Snort signatures as well as custom created signatures on my own to quickly identify what exactly is being targeted. This was, again, not necessarily used as like the say-all, so I didn't go out and say, oh yeah, Snort said that DMP3 was an unauthorized read request to a PLC. I used that as a foundation to then be able to go out and look further into what was attempted. So from that, you're going to see several different rules were triggered. There was Modbus TCP, several of those, which kind of relates to the prior slide. Unauthorized write request and unauthorized read request. So it's someone really actually going out, trying to sniff the traffic or trying to write traffic, either or. And then DNP3, I included 3 as well. A lot of those were false positives. I didn't see any active DNP3 modifications. And I attributed that because to the fact that it's more than likely it's a complex protocol. So in my eyes, it was probably the fact that it's more difficult to find a targeted attacker that really understands DNP3. So all of that is pretty interesting. But in the back of your mind, if it was me, I would be saying, okay, what about those salted documents that you're talking about? Again, it's not the traditional salted method that I'm referring to. This is where it gets even more interesting. So again, I set up a valid email address, valid website, everything valid. But the interesting thing is I put city works with an X because I just wanted to make it a little bit different to maybe flag someone as being just a change. And then I did the host name of our country, or the city.com. I included the actual the email that they sent. Initially I'd included the header information. If you want that, feel free to talk to me and I can give all that to you. It says, hello sir, I am the, and they spoofed the name of the city administrator. So they had gone out to this website of this city, taken the city administrator's name, and used it directly in this email. And like the attached statistics filled out and sent back to me. You're going to notice that the attached statistics. So it's obviously, there's an attached document first. Kindly send me the doc and also advise if you have questions. Look forward you hear from you soon. So a little bit of issue there, right? And then it said Mr. City Administrator name. So he had again used in 2 times the valid city administrator's name of that city. So I took the document and ran it. The document was called cityrequest.doc. For those of you that are interested, I'll provide that to you as well, the actual malware itself. Whenever you actually open the doc, it's just a bunch of ones. So pretty traditional and pretty generic whenever it comes to malware, nothing too advanced there. Looking at it a little bit further, cityrequest.doc, it dumps 2 files on the system itself. File gh.exe, which is essentially just a local password hash dump. And then ai.exe, it shovels a shell back to an actual dump server to be able to exfiltrate documents. That's it. I went out and actually was able to interact directly with the malware itself once I pulled those 2 executables out. The malware is communicating to a drop server, the CNC server in China, and it's exploiting the CVE 2012-0158. So for those of you that are familiar, that's a pretty common exploited Word doc, nothing too crazy there. Execution of the malware, you're going to see an email address, tombkeeper@126.com, with some fairly generic characters there. Once I executed cityrequest.doc, files started leaving the server in question after 5 days. So it took 5 days for this to be executed and for them to actually go out and realize that there was activity happening. There was really 4 things that were of interest that left. The first was a fake VPN config file. Second was a network statistics dump, SAM database dump, and gain persistence via process migration. So I watched process migration occur for persistence purposes. And then I included a SAM database dump, or they included a SAM database dump as well, to ensure that then they could start cracking passwords if there was anything else in that domain. It won't execute on Office 2010, so that's an interesting statistic there. There's some interesting stuff about these documents that allowed me to then ascertain who exactly were the threat actors in the case that I was wanting to, again, profile some of these individual actors as well as countries. I'm not going to get into that in this talk. That's outside of the scope of it, but there are some interesting details there. Some of the malware features: monitors registration keys for value changes. So again, it goes out just like any other traditional malware, monitors registration keys. Creates guard pages. So this is for going out and attempting to prevent any type of reverse engineering and or AV type of engine interaction, antivirus engine interaction, anything like that. Communicates to two C2 IPs, so it's actually actively communicated to two separate C2 IPs. It creates files on the actual system itself, so it goes out and actively creates several files. Obviously, the two executables are two files, but it also creates other files, so it's not just those two. And it creates a fake document and opens it. There's some functionality behind that that's fairly interesting to make the user actually appear as though they're opening that city request document, and it's actually behaving the way that they expect it to. I created a couple diagrams that cover how the attack went down to better visualize it. So this is days 1 through 4. The first step was that the attacker sent a spear-phished email to the actual administrator where I had SMTP running. From there, the attachment was opened, and I opened that on the salted document server for the purpose of being able to then see if the individual attacker would be interested in going out and then exfiltrating any of those files that appeared to be important. The third step was that a backdoor was shoveled to the attacker themselves. And then the fourth was process migration on that server. So once the shell was once the backdoor was shoveled, the actual attacker then went out, accessed the device, and did process migration then for persistency purposes. Days 5 through 17. It's pretty clear on this one that the attacker connects back in at 10 o'clock Central Standard Time, and then data exfiltration occurs directly thereafter. And that's where those 4 files were actually starting to then go out and start to exfiltrate. So, you know, this is an interesting step that it took them an amount of time to realize that the actual box itself was compromised, and then they started to then shovel that information back. And then days 18 on, this is where we're obviously at now. So we're actively running this, and we're actively gathering intelligence and statistics based on what's happening right now on these devices. I can say that it has increased, and I have subsequently added more, I guess, infrastructure to the environment to see what else will happen in the environment itself. So I've added not only just traditional ICS and SCADA devices, but I've also added other traditional devices that you would see, database server, etc. I added those devices as well just to see if there was any interest in those in addition to the SCADA ICS devices. So I'm going to kind of quickly go into the attacker profile. I'm going to keep this very, very high level again, because some of this data I can't necessarily give out right now. So I chose the most prevalent attackers. I profiled, poked, and researched who they were. A lot of the malware was just code reuse. But the interesting thing was I went out and actually started to look at who the attackers were and who these individuals were that were looking into our systems. The interesting thing was one of the C2 servers was actually wide open, had no security behind it whatsoever. So I could actually hop on to the actual server itself and see the documents that they pulled from my server on that box. So they were using it as a dumping ground, essentially. So I was able to access the server, see what was there, and see my files sitting there ready to be pulled off by whatever entity is actually interacting with that server. That was kind of an interesting scenario, and I've never seen it from that angle, so it was pretty cool. And then on there was other statistics as well, and other compromised systems that were communicating back. So it wasn't just this honeypot environment. It was also some governmental agencies, et cetera, that was one central point for all of these dropped documents. You know, everybody's going to be talking, and everybody asks, and they have asked, is this targeted? I mean, I can say that the attacks were targeted, but I can't say 100%. You know, I'm not going to throw out APT. I'm not going to throw out any of that stuff because you don't really know. I can't really go out and say 100% what it is. But what I can say is I put together this really cool Venn diagram, and it's hard to establish what the motivation was, right? Persistence, in my eyes, was kind of the central point in this whole architecture, in this whole environment. Persistence was really the main thing. And in this case, all of the other areas around that are really the big piece. So inflict damage was a big part of this, right? We saw pump modifications. We saw all these things happening. So inflicting damage was an obvious piece of the puzzle that was very important. Reconnaissance was a big piece. I did see a lot of reconnaissance activity. So I would see, for instance, someone probing the system one day. 2 days may go by, and then a slow scan of the system might occur as well. So the attacker might go out, do a slow scan on port, on common ports, 1 to 1024. And then they might wait 2 days, and then they might come back and look at it again. So it was very slow. So there was a lot of reconnaissance work that was occurring on this. Steal data was obviously the third major section because, again, there's data exfiltration, and there's still data exfiltration that's attempting to occur as we speak. The interesting thing is that I have to log on to these systems under the Honeypot environment and generate valid traffic to make it look as though it's really valid. If, for instance, if it's an ICS environment and nothing is going on, that's going to throw a red flag to the actual attackers themselves. So I have to log in every day, generate a bunch of random, for lack of a better term, crap, because I just want to generate traffic to make it look like there's things happening to keep the attackers interested. And then the three intersecting points, hacktivist group, espionage, and cybercrime. I can't really at this point say where does that fit, right? I mean, I can say what happened. I can't establish motivation. I can just present out what I've seen and what it could be. And then persistence is the main point in my eyes because I keep seeing it. I keep seeing it across the entire environment. They're process migrating. They're going in and doing registry edits. They're going in and doing the things that you traditionally see when any type of persistence is actually going out and being gained. So again, this isn't necessarily saying that these attacks are targeted. I don't know. What I'm saying is the motivation is hard to establish, and this is a good baseline to try to say, what could it be? I threw in this diagram just to show, from an APT standpoint, and I use APT loosely, out of the 6 steps, there was 4 steps that I view as being active. The first was intelligence gathering. That's fairly generic, right? You can say intelligence gathered could be anything. I mean, it depends on what your loose term is. Point of entry. So it's delivered via social engineering attack. I think that's obvious based on the email, right? And based on the document itself. No doubt about that. Command and control communication. That's obvious as well, considering I was able to go out, ascertain the actual data itself from the servers that it was dropped on. Lateral movement. I'm seeing some of that, but not to the point where I would feel comfortable saying that I'm seeing it enough. It looks to be maybe, at this point, happenstance, that they're just saying, oh, well, let's just hop over here and look around. It doesn't appear to be dedicated lateral movement and saying, yes, 100%. Asset data discovery. This is, again, just going out and looking for other devices. There is some of that, but I wouldn't feel comfortable saying 100% it's targeted in that case. And then data exfiltration. That's obvious based on the fact, again, I watched the data leave, and then I was able to go out and actually see the server itself. So now for those of you that are in ICS and SCADA, or utilize these devices or look into these devices on a daily basis, I'm going to throw out about 10 different recommendations based on experience in the past working at the large energy company that I did, and then working on this side saying, okay, what are the attacks that I'm seeing and how could you go out and help change this? Disable internet access to all your trusted resources. I say where possible, but I mean, come on, just disable it. You shouldn't need internet access. Your engineers, they have to have access, but do it via SSL VPN. Do it via something that's more secure. Don't just have these protocols open to the internet. That's ridiculous. Maintain trusted resources at the latest patch levels. This is a point of contention with a lot of ICS SCADA guys because it's very difficult to shut these systems down. It's very hard to go out and say, and pitch from a security standpoint, to go in and say, hey, I need to take down this critical server in the SCADA network to be able to patch it. As you saw earlier, it really doesn't matter who says that. Me as a security engineer at my prior company, they didn't care about that. They said, well, is it going to affect downtime? Is it going to affect production? Are you going to stop coal from coming out of the ground? If the answer is yes, sorry, you're out of luck. That's the way it is. So this is a very target-rich environment. Require username and password and 2-factor authentication if possible and where applicable for all systems, including those deemed not trusted. Anything that you can view as in the SCADA or control network should be two-factor authenticated, in my opinion. No doubt about it. Control contractor access. This is a common issue in most engineering and mining companies. Contractor access is massive. There's a lot of contractors that come in and out. There's not a lot of native intelligence and not a native instruction set in an organization, in a mining organization particularly. So they have to bring in a lot of contractors and access these resources, and they really don't pay attention to accounts that they create. They don't go out and modify these with GPOs. They don't control access in these things. So control contractor access. Utilize SSL, TLS for communications. That's, common, I think, for pretty much anything. Control access to trusted devices. Again, that kind of goes back to the same concept of controlling access from a contractor standpoint. So use a Bastion host with ACLs, and whenever I say a Bastion host, I'm referring to a central server that is actually in between two different WAN segments. So between a SCADA WAN segment and a PLC segment, put a Bastion host, and that's the only host that can gain access into that network. That is used with great success, and for those of you that are tasked with going out and trying to improve security very quickly, a quick win is going out and deploying a Bastion host concept and say, only that host can access only those devices. So utilize that concept. It's very quick and it's a good win. Improve logging on trusted environments. This is a huge issue, right? Logging is a massive issue pretty much in any security organization as it is, but it's very important in ICS SCADA environments, primarily because from a forensic point of view, for forensication purposes, it is invaluable. Knowing what happened is invaluable in that case. And then utilize zoning infrastructure, such as a business LAN, a wireless LAN, and a SCADA segment. And then control rigorously between those three segments with firewall rules, with ensure that IPS or IDS is deployed there. Go out and make sure that logging is in there. It's pretty simple. And then finally, develop a threat modeling system to your organization. Understand who's attacking you and why. Understand why they're looking at your organization. Understand what they would find. Understand if they were interested in looking at you as a company, understand why. Do you have something that they want? Do you have something? Do you have data? Do you have geospatial information is a big one. Understand why. And finally, remember, these attacks are happening. They're happening obviously in the USA. They're happening in other places as well. Pretty simple. And we're still seeing that research happen. This is my contact information. And again, for any of the information that you are looking for in addition to the data that I presented, feel free to contact me afterwards, and I'll be happy to share that with you. Thank you.